The first age. The first stage in my fourfold classification is the one before you get a permanent or full-time job. And in most of history and in most societies, obviously, it isn't very long. Characteristically, you start working as a young person part-time, even as young as 7 or 8, and then by the age of 12, 13, 14, as you reach adolescence, you get a job. In England, historically, for example, you became a servant or an apprentice or went to work on a farm at 12, 13, 14. Staying on, and even at that time, if you stayed on and you were from the upper classes and you went on to university, you went to the university at a very young age, 14, 15, and so you were finished at about 18, and then you go into whatever employment you were going to go into. And for many people, most until very recently, 17 or 18 after they'd left school, they'd get in their first job. My own first age was very prolonged, unusually prolonged even by modern standards, in that I continued taking various degrees, 2 doctorates and 2 masters, MAs, until I was just on the verge of my 30th birthday when I went to Cambridge in 1971. So it was a very long first stage, deliberately prolonged because I felt that it would be really the only time when I would have the peace and the quiet and the space to accumulate as much intellectual capital. That's how I looked on it, a sort of mining, and I would mine lots of material so that as I looked at my friends and they went into teaching jobs and other jobs, once you were there was very much less time. And so if you had this, you could then live off it for some years. And also, I didn't feel really ready to get a full-time job. I was still learning so much about the 2 disciplines I was involved with, history and anthropology. So I prolonged it, and I also prolonged even my childhood as much as possible, because even until the age of 19, 20, I was reading children's stories and Arthurian legends and things, because and modelling myself on Wordsworth, I like to think that their enchantment of childhood could be prolonged for some time. There was plenty of time to be a grown-up, so why not enjoy and slow down aging process? So the first stage for me was extremely rich, interesting and diverse, and it is for many people. Obviously, this is the time, at least in childhood, and if you're fortunate not having to go and work in a brick kiln, when you have some leisure, you maybe go to school, you go to kindergarten, you have toys, you have friends. It's a period of relative leisure in some societies, and it certainly was for me. I sort of divide my first stage into sub-parts. The first is in India until the age of 5, when I came home to England. The next, a sort of magical continuation in Dorset between the age of 6 and 8, and then going to boarding school. And that's a great shock and a great change, but still at preparatory school until the age of 12, 13, and moving to the Lake District, it was still a sort of enchanted childhood. I was still really mainly a child. And then comes puberty and adolescence, and for about 4 or 5 years you are changing hugely in your body and your thoughts. And that was my second boarding school. And so those are the first 2 ages. And in that second period you become halfway between child and adult, which is why it's so confusing and difficult for everyone to handle, and for your parents as well. And then a rite of transition away from the last vestiges of childhood, going to university at Oxford as an undergraduate and entering a much wider world, being treated as an adult, called Mr. by the college porters and so on. And you don't quite feel a Mr., but you're on your way there. And so there's this period, which in my case lasted 6 years at Oxford as an undergraduate and a postgraduate. And by the end of that, the age of 24, 25, I really did feel I was an adult and old enough to marry, which I did on my 25th birthday. And so that was another break. But unlike many people, I didn't have a full-time job or any job really when I married. And my wife was training as well and had a job. So we managed, and then did field work and came back and wrote it up and then went to Cambridge. So those are the ages, those are the trainings. And in human beings, that age of dependency, because like the two ends of one's life, the first and the fourth ages, they're characterized by dependency on others. I was living off grants from the foundations and local councils. I was living off handouts from my parents. I was living rent-free in their cottage in the Yorkshire Dales at the end. So I was a dependent, half child, half grown up. And getting my first job at Cambridge, even though it was research again, was the end of dependency. I didn't have to ask for help from anyone else. I was earning it myself. And this long dependency period, of course, is unusual among animals. Many animals, most animals, have to leave the nest or start fending for themselves very, very quickly. Their parents may protect them for a little while, but then they are on their own. So it may be a matter of months or 1 or 2 years, and then they are on their own. Human beings take this long, long period to acculturate themselves. Even ordinary human beings are dependent and looked after by their parents, usually until the age of 10 or so. And that's a very long time, because in many of those sorts of societies, you would only last till you're about 60 or something like that on average, and therefore it's a sixth of your life, which is a long period. And that's characteristic of humans, but not others. So the first stage is very formative, and that's what I learnt about it when I wrote my autobiography. And I have devoted 9 out of 10 volumes of my autobiography so far to documenting that first age. Each stage of it has a volume, and it's based on contemporary documents, so it's not based on my memories. It's based on what I wrote and others wrote at the time. And so I can reconstruct month by month how I grew from infancy through to adulthood. And I can see in that period that all my character was formed very early on. I should think, I guess, at least 60-70% was already formed when I came back to England at the age of 5. And each year added a large amount, so that by the time I went to Oxford, the age of 18, I was 80% who I am now, probably more. And even in my ideas, because having those early materials, I can look back at the roots of ideas which I'm still pursuing now, writing books about, and throughout my life. And I can see that many of these ideas and approaches to life are there at the age of 18, 19, 20 in my undergraduate or postgraduate work. And so it's really just been a development of that. Many people without that kind of material think that they have put away that period. They learnt very little, etc. And then they became who they are. That's not my impression at all. And the last thing to say is that looking back at this question of whether I'm the same person as I was when I was 10 or 15 or 20, And the answer, of course, is both the same and different. I feel underneath the surface, just as I did when I was in the Lake District at the age of 15 or 16, with the same hobbies and passions, or different hobbies, but certainly enthusiasms and desire to collect and keep, and the friendliness towards people, but mixed with a certain shyness. I feel all that is the same. And yet, of course, physically I've changed enormously. My attitudes have changed. There's been various social and intellectual and political revolutions since the 50s. And so, of course, I've gone with that. So someone looking at my life from the outside would say, well, he's the same little boy, but he's also entirely different grown up.